Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm a senior editor with the Mises Institute, and with me today is my associate editor, Tho Bishop. And we're back again, and this time I wanted to touch on something we haven't done in a while because it's simply been knocked off the headlines and out of people's feeds by the war, by COVID, by other issues. And I just want to talk about the economy a little bit. This, of course, will touch on the war and on sanctions, but rather than looking at the outcome of the war in terms of geopolitical advantage or what's going on in terms of military strategy, just look at what's going to be going on in terms of the dollar in the U.S. economy. What can we expect in the next year in terms of those things, and maybe look a little bit at what the political effects will be come this fall. But let's just get right into it, though. How you doing? And I assume if you're like me, you've seen in your own social media feeds and the places you follow, it's actually hard to find a good article about the economy and the dollar anymore unless you go looking for it.
Right. But a lot of chatter about it. Nothing gets people talking about economic issues quite like gas steadily approaching $5 a gallon. And I think this is a dynamic here where, again, we're starting to see the consequences of a lot of self-defeating, self-sabotaging policies of the West. And I think this is one of the running themes when we look at this crisis in Ukraine play out generally, is that, you have a American regime that is, wants to respond very forcefully to this act of aggression that Russia is committing against a neighbor, yet the West's hands are tied in terms of how it can realistically respond because of all of the policy decisions of the last 20 years that have brought us to a situation where, countries that otherwise have plenty of domestic energy supplies are dependent upon countries like Russia. We have complications caused by the saturation of debt within Western countries, and what are going to be the underlying connections between sanctions and basically a massive embargo of the Russian economy in a variety of different environments. What Europe, their direct connection with Russian markets. Luckily, we don't have quite that same level of interdependence, but these policies, the West's dependence of economic warfare as being their default tool in trying to manage these sort of conflicts, something that we've seen them perfect and expand, the last 20 years, beginning with war on terror and then, actions against Iran and Venezuela and some of these other actors. These have real consequences to the domestic population. And while, there's been a large percentage of this country that have perhaps not really felt true sacrifice in the war on terror, or, when we increase prices of medicine in Iran, they are feeling today the very real consequences of our economic war against Russia, and how this ends up affecting us locally, politically in November. How the last, I fear that the same way there was a lot of expectation that you could turn on and turn off the economy when it came to COVID lockdowns, how quickly normalization can come if peace were to break out tomorrow, right? I think there are very valid concerns to be had about the degree to which our policymakers really know the consequences of these decisions that are being made right now. And again, everyone is starting to feel the consequence and the pain that comes from engaging in a conflict with a large market.
Yeah, I think the reality is that the world's not exactly beginning this potentially global conflict from a very strong position, right? We had not only was COVID a problem, but the global economy was already weakening in 2019. And so there was evidence that 2020 was going to be a pretty weak year all on its own. So you ended up with even a far worse situation than that. And so looking at the larger global context, right, you were already in a situation where there's global economic weakness. In terms of the specific current conflict, the U.S. is not really all that heavily invested, as you noted, with Russia. German ties with Russia are far greater, and not just in terms of natural gas and energy, but just larger overall. And I think we started to see a rift there between U.S. policy and Germany in terms of Germany took a much more even-handed view towards China and Russia in terms of what sort of trade ties should we have. But in terms of overall U.S. trade with Russia is pretty weak. But looking at what could the results of the current embargoes and policy and the war be, there seems to be a certain narrative that's come out from this, I think really just hopping on the back of those general feelings of malaise, the fact that we could sense that the West was already in a position of weakness. We could sense that the dollar was under pressure because there had just been so much money printing, if you will, going on over the last couple of years, so that the Congress could spend an extra $3, $4, $5, $6 trillion. And so that led many people to reasonably conclude that this puts the dollar in a very weak position. But I think if we look overall at the general context here, the dollar isn't necessarily in the worst position. So when we look at the dollar, when we look at issues of, say we cast out Russia from the Western economy, which may or may not really be something the U.S. can accomplish. What does that mean? Does that create this global bloc between Russia and China that can really rival the West? I don't know about that. And just really, where does this leave the economy overall in terms of economic growth? And I think looking at those three issues then, I think we could say that, yeah, it definitely weakens global growth overall, starting trade embargoes, cutting off international flows of goods and services. That's obviously problematic in terms of global economic growth, as well as devoting huge sums of money and resources to war making instead of doing things that actually increase people's standard of living. So, okay, that's a problem. The second one is the whole, well, let's force China and Russia to start their own bloc. I'm not sure how successful that will be. As you pointed out in your column yesterday, and I also noted in my column this morning because it's just so interesting, is the fact that, well, not all countries are really going to play along with the idea of the U.S. embargo of Russia. You've got countries like Mexico, Brazil, India, and certainly China, who are a little bit more reluctant to engage in some sort of embargo there. So whether or not that works is one issue. And then the other issue is, well, how big is this bloc? Will this start attracting the rest of the world to the Russia-China bloc and isolating the U.S.? And I see no evidence of that whatsoever. Even if we took Russia and China, put them together and looked at them as a percentage of global GDP, you're looking at maybe 1/5, 20%-ish, combining Russia's and China's. And of course, Russia's GDP is so small. It's just a small percentage of China's and the U.S.'s. But let's put them together. We come up with about 20% of global GDP. If you take the U.S. and you take Europe and you take Japan together, that's more, it's about a third of global GDP. So it seems that the U.S. could certainly survive in this Western bloc, or with its sphere of influence, Asian countries all continuing as usual with their own economy. And then there's the issue of the dollar. Right? Where will this cause the collapse of the dollar? Because foreign countries will then abandon their reserves of dollars, and then you're cutting off a significant fraction of the global economy from using the dollar. The dollar's not really in the worst position there when you look at the euro and you look at other potential rival currencies. So all of this together, at least in the short term, I mean, anything could happen in the medium or long term. But I'm just not seeing a clear situation where this sinks the U.S. in terms of its economic power, its soft power. It seems those things are still well secured as far as the U.S. regime goes. Now, I wish things would happen that would humble the U.S. regime, but the rest of the world's regimes are so poorly run, as you would expect, it makes the U.S. look almost reasonable by comparison.
Right. And that's been one of the things that I think that, I've always appreciate the work on Mises.org from, some of our scholars like Daniel Lacaille, Brendan Brown, and others that have done a great job kind of holding up a big warning sign saying that, while it's proper and accurate to highlight all the things the Fed gets wrong, like let's talk about the ECB. I mean, you really want to see things getting nuts. And you're correct that, the degree to which I think, where the dollar, its biggest advantage has always been it relative to everyone else. I do think it is, there's two different dynamics of this as well. One is what is the damage that Russia and China, which I think they themselves, you have to put them in kind of in their own box. I think those are the two countries that have been, there's been a lot of drumbeats, over the past decade plus about interest within their governments at challenging truly that sort of unipolar dollar-driven world. Even though you've had, even it was Mark Carney with the Bank of England a few years ago highlighting how America had abused that privilege, right? It's necessarily gung-ho on the sanctions regime on Russia. I think they're kind of, I think their interest is whatever's, in their best interest at that moment, rather than perhaps some of the more ambitious plans of Russia and China there. The degree to which, I think there's often a trap where we can see everything going wrong with the West and overstate the goals and intentions of these other countries. For example, while Russia has been very strong at keeping down its debt levels relative to the rest of the world, while simultaneously, they have increased gold holdings significantly over the past decade. They ramped them up during 2014. They've been ramping it up here recently as well. Financial Times is kind of mocking them for their fetish of gold. What's interesting is that if you actually read the analysis going out there from people within the orbit of like Alexander Dugin, who is credited as being on one of the far-right intellectuals of Russia that has influence within political circles, you see him chanting about how America's response to Russia is undermining the dollar's global strength. And then, within the same article, not written by Dugin himself, but promoted by him, talking about how now this will unchain Russia and allow it to embrace modern monetary policy as a way of fortifying Russia's economy in this new, post America global dominant sort of order. And I think it's important to recognize that these countries, Russia, China, whatever, I mean, they do not have any more interest than America does in terms of these restraints that sound economics places on their own policies. China's addiction to debt is even greater than what we've seen in the West. And so I don't think that there's some sort of silver bullet that Russia's going to pull out and they're going to end up knocking out the West because they embrace sound economics while everyone else is dedicated to this sort of neoliberal, vulgar, Keynesian sort of markup that is defined most of global decision making for decades now. I do think, though, on the other side is that there is a dynamic here where the actual physical resources that Russia has, right? That compared to all of the ways that the West has undermined its own ability to process energy, to develop secure trade routes to various resources. I mean, it's very interesting now where you basically now have America going hat in hand to Venezuela of all countries, desperate to try to tap into them as a new source of oil exports, to make up for the new embargo on Russian oil and the resulting lack of cooperation from our good friends in Saudi Arabia and OPEC. And that dynamic, I think, is interesting as well. Not only does it highlight the degree to which that there is a very clear desperation from America and the West, but it's interesting in its own right that Venezuela is willing to take up that phone call. I think that might itself indicate that the ability of a Russia and China to keep Venezuela bribed, and well funded, to keep them out of America's orbit in this regard. Perhaps there is some stress. I think that itself is revealing some of the stresses that the other two countries are facing in their own right, while we have this disconnection, this massive divergence within these economies going on right now. The scary thing, though, is that even if America maintains its strength relative to the rest of the world, what concerns me is that we're leading to a dynamic, again, while we're just getting out of globally the horrors of the government's response to COVID. Even if America remains the strongest economy in the world, the dollar remains king, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The impact that this will have for lowering the economic environment for all countries as a whole is very concerning. Because again, I think once again we're recognizing how the supply chains and the interconnectedness of this global economy that perhaps we took for granted, or at least a lot of people were taking for granted for a very long time, in a time of relative peace and stability. Right after the supply chain issues caused by COVID, right after the degree to which inflation has created havoc within American markets and otherwise, here's yet another massive challenge to the standing order. And again, I do not think that the individuals at the Fed or the Treasury are in a position to know what it would even look like to try to minimize the real pain that's going to be felt from this.
Yeah, this is always an important point, is that, look, the Russian regime, the Chinese regime, any regime knows that they benefit from an inflationary monetary scheme. So I have yet to see really critics of the whole idea of Western neoliberalism arrive at a conclusion that what we need is laissez-faire, free markets. I can't find any real criticisms of Western neoliberalism, unless by neoliberalism they mean interventionism in the way that Mises meant it. But mostly when people mean Western neoliberalism, they mean that's that economic system that's way too laissez-faire, and that mostly the left and the critics of neoliberalism use neoliberalism as code for free markets. They lump in everybody from Hillary Clinton to anybody who's insufficiently socialistic into that idea. And mostly what I see then is they want something like MMT. They want some sort of third way where there's a lot more socialism being used. And so I'm unconvinced that any of these regimes are interested in introducing some sort of gold-based currency. I could see how obviously they want more gold, they want more assets so they can bail themselves out in case they face a currency crisis. And somebody's shorting their currency, maybe they could then make the sorts of purchases they need to stabilize the currency. And if you have a lot of gold, that's, I think, easier to do. But that's a long way from trying to establish a gold-based currency. I mean, even the Swiss regime resists that, as well as do a lot of the Swiss voters, because they recently, a few years ago, had a vote on whether to do that, and it was rejected. So that doesn't seem to be in the cards anywhere that I'm looking at. And what's funny is that, as you point out, because we're now facing restrictions in the global market, and in terms of the dollar losing purchasing power in terms of oil, they're now looking to get oil anywhere they can. And I think we can use this then to segue, I think, into the idea of how is the U.S. market doing overall in terms of inflation and job growth and all of those issues. And I think this idea that, okay, we need to go and beg for more oil so we can keep the cost of living down in the United States, I think is significant. Now, we hear a lot of the time from economists assuring us that the economy is great. And this is just what you've come to expect from mainstream economists, right? They can never contain their their patronizing view of regular people, and they chuckle to themselves as they talk about how regular people just don't understand how good they've got it, and they just don't understand how inflation works, and that inflation's really in their minds. They're overstating it because of prejudices and biases against the idea of inflation and so on. And they're filled with explanations about how things are great. But I think when we really look at how inflation's really affecting people in terms of home ownership, rents, just groceries, those sorts of things, 7.5% is huge. Even if you get it down to 3-4%, well, first of all, you lost that 7.5% already in terms of inflation, and I suppose you can hope for a 4, 5, 6% increase in your salary, but that seems unlikely. And while gas prices won't stay high forever, they're high now, and that really does affect people. Let's look at employment. Let's see. February's employment was 150 million. That's still 2 million below the total from 2020, from February 2020 before the COVID crisis. So still down from that old peak. Let's look at labor participation rates in the 25 to 54 age range. So I'm excluding retirees. That's still down below both 2019 and 2018 levels. So this idea that the economy is just red hot and people are flocking back to their employment, there's apparently something still keeping people from employment. And I have yet to hear a convincing explanation of what exactly that is. It could be tied to any number of issues, but the cost of living is not going down for these people. These people are facing real issues, not to mention just all the unpleasantness that comes from a situation where you're facing a lot of geopolitical risk. I mean, people look out there and they're worried about where the economy is going. And so that affects people as well. So enough of this. The aggregate numbers show that everything is magnificent. There's clearly a lot of reticence on the part of regular people to just go out there and proclaim everything back to normal and everything being great.
Well, and of course, a part of that is that savings rates in this country are very, very low, and most of the people that have, no one's keeping money in a bank account by just holding with traditional cash holdings or anything like that, right? And so people's retirements are, overwhelmingly placed in stock markets or, crypto, which kind of ebbs or flows depending on expectations on how the regime's going to try to handle crypto regulations going forward and things like that. And so you have a lot more, you have a lot of people, holding their breath every time they see how news out of Russia ends up tanking stock markets, because so much of their livelihood is now based in far more risky forms of savings than back in the day of keeping cash holdings in a bank with a normal with a decent interest rate. So we've created a much more fragile environment in this regard. And when you have incidents like Russia invading Ukraine, which are not being priced in global markets, it's a very concerning situation. I'm also interested to see the dynamic to which, how does this change the policy landscape within the West when it comes to questions like energy development? Because again, we've seen Putin's had no stronger ally in fortifying his weight within Europe than Greta Thunberg and all of these green parties that have pushed nations in Europe to close down nuclear power plants, to increase the cost of traditional oil production, things like that. I'm interested to see, does this lead to a pivot in European countries? Obviously, we've seen in America, this has become a major point within Republican circles. It is something that the Biden administration has not budged on. The optics, again, of going to Venezuela is interesting, particularly when you consider the political dynamics there of Hispanic support moving to the Republican Party. The Venezuelan population that is in the U.S. is probably not overly enthused at the idea of us trying to bail out the Maduro regime by purchasing their oil. While in the short term, the Biden administration may be committed to the Green New Deal style approach of the past. I have a very good feeling that after the 2022 election, that will no longer be the prevailing wisdom, at least of the legislative branch. And in much the same way, where I think there's a very good possibility that the consequences of politicized medicine during the era of COVID, right? Mandates, the grave polarization and how to treat COVID during that time. I think the damage that has done for the cause of universal single payer within America, which is one of those policies that was getting a very steady drumbeat pushed by Bernie Sanders and his Medicare for All sort of platform. I think that's going to be much harder to pass now than it was in 2019. I think you could see a similar lasting impact on some of these green policies, which in the long run could be beneficial economically. Of course, that goes with the assumption that nuclear war does not erupt between here and there. Though it was interesting, there was a fascinating paper by a investment analysis fund highlighting that now is a good since the increase of risk in risk of a nuclear war has gone up dramatically and affected prices. Now is a great time to buy long-term assets, because basically either there is no nuclear holocaust, in which case these assets are being underappreciated in value, or it is, and who cares what your investment platform is. So again, I am glad to see that even in times like this, there is some good commentary coming out there on how to properly take into account some of these beautiful challenges that 2022 has thrown to us.
Well, of course, there's always that constant debate over whether you're a declinist or not in terms of geopolitical fortune telling. And people are always arguing, is the U.S. in decline economically and in terms of geopolitics? But maybe this is the third school, the apocalyptic school. You could be an anti-declinist. You think the U.S. is growing in power. You could be a declinist. Or you think that it might all just end in a fireball. So just do whatever makes sense in the short term and hedge yourself against nuclear war because then you won't have to pay off your debts and so on. I mean, this is pretty messed up stuff. So in all of this, we are assuming there is no nuclear World War III. And I think we can say then that assuming that doesn't happen, economic growth continues to be a big issue here, right? And this relates to a couple of different things. Obviously, it relates to relative growth between the U.S. and other areas of the globe, Europe, China, Russia, etc. And that's important as a function of just the total debt and the reliability of the debt payments that would be coming out of those regimes. So what I mean by that is when you're looking at which currency should I get and which debt should I buy, it looks like the U.S. continues to be in a pretty decent position for that as well. So we can look at it and we can see that there are issues here in terms of the weakness of the U.S. economy. But we're already starting to see speculation about whether Europe is actually in recession now. And while we can expect growth in the U.S. to be extremely anemic, the agreement seems to be that it's even worse in Europe. And I think you have a potential fear there of if Europe goes into recession and starts to really have problems in terms of economic growth versus the growth of its total debt load, you could potentially get a sovereign debt crisis in that situation. And so I think that then feeds into itself, where you've got fewer people who want the euro and fewer people who want to buy European debt. That just further benefits the United States yet again. And so even as the U.S. is in a position where the cost of living is going up and economic growth might be real mediocre, when you look around at the rivals, people aren't going to invest in countries that look like they might be entering into a situation of extreme risk, like Russia or potentially even China. If that's going to end up, there might be some fear that China ends up getting more isolated as well. That's, again, all in terms of the U.S.'s relative favor. Now, in absolute terms, right, people are probably facing continued malaise and declining growth in standard of living, or maybe even a total flattening out. But again, this whole idea that the dollar is going to collapse just doesn't seem to be playing out, at least in the short term. But before we leave that topic, what do you think of people in terms of looking for alternatives to the dollar then, right? I get questions about, well, how will this affect crypto, gold? What do you think is going to be probably the outcome of that 1 year from now or 5 years from now? Do you think it'll really feed into fueling crypto, or is that probably going to be overblown in the short term?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting. I do think you're going to start seeing government actors start, change the way that they treat some of this sort of stuff. We've already kind of seen El Salvador, which has made changes, which, there's some controversies in terms of some of the details of their treatment of Bitcoin and the coercive aspects to it. And I think all those concerns are valid. But it is interesting that you now have nations, actively trying to court investment for trying to empower and normalize the use of Bitcoin transactions within day-to-day lives of residents. And I think that's something where you have this dynamic where, again, I think that the headwinds that the global economy is having, particularly nations that aren't the U.S. Again, the euro in particular, where you have a banking system that has been dealing with negative interest rates for a very long time now. There's concerns out there about the amount of exposure that they have to Russian firms, which may create issues. I know there's been a lot of concerns about the quality of their debt with Chinese companies and things like that. If you have a crisis within the euro, one of the benefactors of that is going to be dollars, right? As being the traditional safe haven asset there. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if you start seeing Bitcoin in particular being embraced by more countries within a pinch. There's been investment made in a variety of ways of other sort of crypto schemes, and I think a lot of valid concern about the dangers posed by some of these other sort of digital monies and the ways that those could be tracked by their central banks, and the degree to which we might be setting up, kind of new tools to be used in sort of the authoritarian sort of surveillance wing of the state. I'm also interested to see, so again, how state actors respond, and I think that you will start seeing, more activity, with in some of these areas. I'm also just interested to see it on a domestic sphere, where are you going to start seeing a state like Texas, for example, which has its own state depository bank. Do you see a scenario where an inflationary environment leads to Texas to start buying gold rather than U.S. securities or cash holdings and things like that? Again, Texas is something that's particularly set up for gold in particular. We've already seen progress made within Wyoming in the way that it is treated Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. We've seen within the state of Florida, more at a local level, the city of Miami now receives taxes in Bitcoin and holds Bitcoin and has its own sort of crypto ambitions there. My own county, actually, you can now pay your taxes in Bitcoin using some of their kiosks. So again, we're seeing that being adopted just within, by various governing entities. That it wouldn't surprise me if you start seeing that sort of progress continue. As you see attempts by various nationalist right-wing leaders trying to offer an alternative to the current status quo politically, I'm very interested to see whether they start taking seriously the possibility for Bitcoin and these alternative fintechs, and providing not only a political solution that might help for savings of their citizens, but also dealing with some of the censorship concerns that we've seen played out with the way that Canada weaponized its banking system against the truckers, the way America has dealt with certain sort of right-wing figures within the U.S. And so it's this dynamic where domestic tensions coupled with international instability may lead to a broader populist appreciation that translates within policy. And that's the other side of it, is that when you have as a consequence of the economic fallout of this conflict, and all the stresses that are being placed on working class citizens all around the world at this point, what does this mean when you have presidential elections going on in France? What does this mean in Germany? What does this mean again, obviously with the 2022 elections, but perhaps even in 2024? Again, if Trump is the opponent, is the Republican candidate there, and Americans are materially worse off, it's going to be very. I think it's going to be a very effective line on, hey, don't you wish it was 2019 again? And here you have a nostalgic offering for the president who's in charge there. If the political fallout of this creates a broad transition within the West that you didn't really see under Trump, right? You had Trump versus NATO, the NATO status quo, and even Boris Johnson kind of ended up being more European than the Trump ally that maybe some of them thought. If you see a blanket change within the West as a byproduct and a backlash of all this, it will be interesting then to see, what might come about when when it comes to dealing with the consequences of everything that's gone on, with COVID and Ukraine and also larger issues of, a decade plus of slow growth. I remember all the people that were excited about turning the page after 2020, thinking that, we're going to get back to normal after this past year of COVID. It just seems like one thing after another. The roaring 20s, maybe bringing all sorts of, we'll continue to bring interesting things going forward.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that, and we will find out later this year what are the real repercussions of the current war. It could be that it will seem like ancient history 6 months from now, but it's too hard to tell. So we'll be back next week with another episode of Radio Rothbard. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.